Hello, this is Todd Luck, and one of the joys of doing retro reviews, like what I'm doing with Dark Horse Tarzan from the 90s, is that you discover new things that you didn't know about along the way. And so I was planning on doing a review of a miniseries that came out in 1999, but then I discovered a miniseries that came out at the exact same time that I had completely forgotten about. What I neglected to think about was that in 1999, there may have been a little bitty thing that happened with Tarzan. Like, I don't know, the release of the highest grossing Tarzan movie of all time that put the character in the hearts and minds of children everywhere and quite a few adults. And so when a movie that big came out in the 90s, oftentimes you ended up with a comic book adaptation of it. And so, yes, this is a review of Disney's Tarzan, a two-issue miniseries adapting the animated movie published by Dark Horse Comics in June and July of 1999. And quick note, I have done a separate review of the Disney Tarzan movie and its story, so if you're interested in that, you can check that video out. All right, so let's go ahead and get my only real negative comments out of the way, and that would be about the covers. These really look just like convention sketches that were done in 5 minutes or less. This miniseries really deserved covers that had more going on, and I am going to show you in a minute one of the covers we should have gotten on this. So when you open it up, you'll be greeted by this gorgeous artwork that looks like it's straight out of the movie, but you're going to notice these odd borders at the top and bottoms of the pages. And when you see something like that, of course, you know that this artwork was not drawn for an American comic book format. This was drawn for pages that had different proportions, and these borders are basically just there to try to shoehorn it into an American comic book page. And I do believe I have found the original format that it was intended for. So this is pages from a book I found on Amazon that has the same comic adaptation of the movie, except the artwork does fit the pages here. This is in French, and I don't know if this was the only language this was printed in, and I also don't know the size of the book, whether it was bigger or smaller than an American comic book. And here's the cover for this book or graphic novel. And it's gorgeous. It perfectly captures the movie and the characters in it. And this, I believe, is the cover we should have gotten on at least one of the issues of the American version. But moving past the covers and the borders, the artwork here is absolutely gorgeous. Everything is spot on to the movie. Here's Kala finding baby Tarzan. The comic does its best to recreate the shots from the movie and recreate all the key scenes. Here's Kerchak being his usual happy self. And the coloring is bright and vibrant and perfectly captures the movie. And yes, little kid Tarzan is as cute as all get out with his little loincloth that he has, even though he probably shouldn't know what clothing is. Every scene from the movie is here, though you will notice that some of it's summarized and some of the shots and various montages are left out. You know, the musical numbers are obviously not there because this is a comic. But this is an adaptation that knows when to slow down and do certain scenes blow by blow, like when Tarzan puts the mud on his face to try to look like the other apes and Kala wipes it off and comforts him. This is an adaptation that knows what the heart of the story is. Occasionally you might notice a piece of fruit or a tiny frog that might be a different color than the movie, but this does an incredibly accurate job of portraying what was on the screen in comic book format. And the interesting thing about movie adaptations is oftentimes they have more than what was on the screen, right? Because oftentimes they're based on earlier versions of the script and will contain passages and sometimes even plot revelations that never made it to the screen. And so I found 2 additional lines of dialogue that weren't in the movie. And so one of them is when they introduce Professor Porter, he's with Clayton, and Clayton tells him not to move. And Professor Porter takes it in this ridiculous literal sense where he's standing on one leg and trying to hold that position. And so in the comic book, Professor Porter tells her that Clayton told him not to move, just like in the movie. But in the comic, she says, imagine that, and has this very deadpan look on her face. And I imagine that was taken out just because it seems a little snarky. Jane just seems like she's being a little mean to her father. And so a moment later in the same scene, Professor Porter gets really excited and he asks Jane, do you know what you're standing in? And then she looks down and he says, it's a gorilla's nest. And so in the comic book, when he asks, do you know what you're standing in? She looks down, checks her feet and says, oh no, not again. And I imagine this was probably just taken out because they didn't want a poop joke there. But that's it. No major revelations about anything that made it into the comic adaptation that weren't in the movie. However, one of the joys of reading a comic book of a movie instead of watching it is that when you're watching it, at least for me, I never catch every single word that's uttered during the movie, right? There's always going to be a word here and there that I'm not going to be able to understand or I'm not even going to hear. And so in comic books, right, since you're reading it, you're going to get every word and you're going to realize certain things that you may not have gotten from the actual movie. So this is probably something everybody realized but me. But in the movie, Tarzan's best friend is an ape or gorilla named Turk. And so I assume Turk was short for Turkos, which is a name of a male ape in the novels. I was wrong. It turns out it is short for Turkina. It's a female character. And I never realized that this entire time. Turk is voiced by Rosie O'Donnell. I'm not sure if I knew that, but it probably wouldn't have made much difference since it's very, very common for females to voice young males like Bart Simpson or Ash Ketchum. But it's just kind of cool to finally realize that Turk is a chick. Each of these issues is 29 pages a pop as far as the story goes. And so that is a 58-page adaptation. And even when you leave out the musical stuff, that doesn't sound like a lot to adapt a movie. But as far as American adaptations of movies in comic book format go, it's actually a pretty decent length. So for instance, when Eastman and Laird and Jim Lawson adapted the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, this was only 48 pages. But that wasn't all that uncommon of a length for a movie adaptation, right? If you go back to the Marvel Super Specials, like for instance, this Blade Runner, yeah, it is thicker. It's actually 66 pages if you count everything in here. But a good portion of that was taken up by photos in the back. So the actual comic adaptation itself of Blade Runner was only 47 pages. But plenty of movies have gotten longer adaptations. So when Marvel Super Special did Santa Claus the movie back in the 80s, it got a 64-page graphic novel. And I am going to try to do a review of this in December if I can remember it this year. Of course, DC gave the 89 Batman movie a 64-page graphic novel with a wraparound cover. Some movies actually received miniseries, like this 4-part adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula put out by Topps Comics in the 90s, and I do plan to review this for October. And of course, Star Wars movies have always had multi-part adaptations. Probably the longest comic book movie adaptation I've heard of would be the original Star Wars, which took up the first 6 issues of the ongoing Star Wars series. But no matter how long a comic book movie adaptation is, I've never read one that I thought was long enough. And comic book movie adaptations really aren't there to replicate the exact experience, but just to capture it in a different format. And it comes out of a time when movies were watched on the big screen, right? You either watched it on the big screen or you might be able to watch it once a year on TV if you got really lucky, and you waited a little bit, but you couldn't just go home and just watch it anytime you wanted. So in order to recreate that experience, there was all kinds of things that were put out. Along with comic adaptations, there were usually trading cards adapting the movie. There were soundtracks, fan clubs with newsletters like Lucasfilm's Bantha Tracks, souvenir magazines. And so some of that does continue today. You still see magazines based on movies. You still can get movie soundtracks. A lot of that stuff has moved online. And we no longer need comics to kind of recreate that experience for watching a movie anymore, because all we have to do is sit on our couch, push a few buttons on our remotes, and we can watch any movie we want to. If you want to, Disney Plus has Tarzan right now, and you can just play it right now anytime you want to. And so even if they don't have the same purpose anymore, I do miss comic book adaptations of movies. I just love the idea of taking a story, whether that's a novel, a TV show, or a movie, and turning it into sequential art. And I'm very glad that I discovered this comic book adaptation. And as big as Disney Tarzan was, it was the highest grossing Tarzan movie of all time, even adjusted for inflation. It had a direct-to-video sequel, an animated television series, action figures, merchandise, children's books, you name it. It was its own little franchise for several years there, and you would think that they would have used that to put out stuff of regular Tarzan comic books and the like, and actually get kids into that version of the character, something that would sustain their love of Tarzan when Disney moved on to other things. But of course, that didn't happen, and instead, in February of 2000, the final regular Tarzan comic in America would be published, and after that, he would stop having regular comics and would just really fade from mainstream consciousness, except for Disney Tarzan, which of course would stop a few years after that. And so on that cheery note, join me for my next retro review as we discover the final fate of 90s Dark Horse Tarzan. Like and subscribe for more videos, and until next time, see ya.